Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order. Let me begin by thanking everyone for attending, thanking each of the witnesses for being here. The topic before us is an issue of great importance, our right to religious liberty, and how it is in danger around the world and here at home. Abroad, there are few rights both so important and yet so commonly disregarded by tyrannical regimes as the rights of conscience. And at home, we see that religious liberty and conscience rights are falling out of favor with an increasingly intolerant segment of the media, the academy, and the entertainment industry. These developments should trouble Americans across the political spectrum. It wasn't all that long ago that religious liberty was an area of bipartisan agreement. It was an issue that brought us together, Republicans and Democrats. Only 25 short years ago, then Representative Chuck Schumer and Senator Ted Kennedy introduced, and a unanimous House and a near unanimous Senate passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was signed into law by a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. This landmark legislation reflected the overwhelming bipartisan respect for our fundamental religious freedoms. But how things have changed in 25 years. We saw in the prior conference our Democratic colleagues voting on a party line vote to gut the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that had passed with such overwhelming support just 25 years earlier. And the threats to these freedoms, to our religious liberty, both in the United States and around the world, are never ceasing. We need candor and we need resolve if we're going to identify and stop these abuses. I'm glad then that this committee has assembled an experienced set of witnesses who can speak authoritatively about the conditions, the motivations, and the harms that surround religious persecution. The space in which it is deemed acceptable to practice one's faith shrinks potentially each and every day. And it's become harder and harder to have an honest conversation about what it means for Americans and the state of American liberty across the board. Many have forgotten exactly why religious liberty is protected, have forgotten the painful consequences that scar a man's soul when the right to free exercise is suppressed and the right to conscience abused. We've forgotten what's lost, what's at stake in these political skirmishes about suppressing a faith that is different from your own. For all of our nation's troubles, the United States inherited a rich tradition of religious liberty that still has not yet faded from the public mind. There's been some erosion, to be sure. But many of our cultural and constitutional barriers protecting our fundamental right to worship God Almighty according to our faith, according to our conscience, and to live according to that faith and conscience, many of those barriers still remain firm. All across the globe, people suffer under tyranny. Either their government or forces emboldened by it muzzle, harass, terrorize, imprison, and even kill in order to stifle an alternative religious voice. Their stories are heartbreaking. Men and women imprisoned, houses of worship burned, congregations forced to register with the government, minority religions taxed into poverty, people of faith being treated as second-class citizens, denied even the right to participate in the market as an equal player, all because of what and how they believe. Tyrannical states seek to abolish religions altogether, to co-opt them into a state-approved form, or to list a slate of state-approved congregations. We see some of the world's most cruel despots stamping out or trying to stamp out disfavored religions, from North Korea to Iran to China. This hearing came together because there's a lot all of us can learn. The persecution of communities of faith abroad can be addressed in a way free from the political baggage of our debates here at home. And the breadth and intensity of this issue illustrates what's at stake. We cannot pretend that violations of religious liberty is a victimless act, nor can we ignore that far too often it is a precursor to other acts of violence, intimidation, and tyranny. The purpose of today's hearing is to learn what happens when an assault on religious liberty reaches its logical conclusion. To attack religious liberty is to attack the dignity of a person. It is to deny him or her equal citizenship and to erode that which makes us free. The consequences of doing so are pervasive and acute, and we must remain vigilant to ensure that the same does not happen here at home. Senator Hirono. Thank you, Senator Hirono. I'll now move to introducing the witnesses. First witness is Dr. Thomas Farr. Dr. Farr is the director of the Religious Freedom Research Project at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He is an associate professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the president of the Religious Freedom Institute. He is also a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion and at the Witherspoon Institute. Dr. Farr graduated from Mercer University and has received his PhD in history from the University of North Carolina. He led a distinguished 28-year career in the United States Army and the Foreign Service. Dr. Farr has taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and at the Air Force Academy. From 1999 to 2003, Dr. Farr was the first director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. Since then, he has continued to advocate for international religious liberty. Dr. Farr has written extensively about religious liberty issues and U.S. national security policy. He is a consultant to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on International Justice and Peace, and he serves on numerous nonprofit boards and teaches regularly at the Foreign Service Institute. Our second witness is Dr. Bob Fu. Dr. Fu is president of China Aid, a Christian nonprofit fighting tirelessly to promote religious liberty and human rights in China. Dr. Fu knows the difficulty of being a faithful Christian in China firsthand. He spent time in prison on charges of, quote, illegal evangelism for operating a house church in Beijing before escaping to the United States, where he has dedicated himself to supporting and encouraging the brave men and women in China who continue to struggle for the fundamental freedom of practicing their faith. Dr. Fu is the son of farmers. He studied English literature at Lao Cheng University, where his American teachers would sometimes share their faith after class from pocket Bibles. In 1989, he led a group of students participating in the pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. In the aftermath of the regime's brutal crackdown, which saw many of his friends and colleagues betray one another, Dr. Fu found comfort in the help and kindness of his Christian teachers. After reading a book about the experience of a Chinese convert to Christianity, he embraced the Christian faith himself. Soon, along with his wife, Dr. Fu was leading a house church, secretly preaching the gospel at night. During the day, he taught English at a school for Communist Party officials. In his own words, he was, quote, God's double agent. In 1996, Dr. Fu and his wife were arrested by communist authorities for their evangelism, and they spent 2 months in prison. They fled China in 1997, assisted along the way by other Chinese Christians. At the time of their escape, Dr. Fu's wife, Heidi, was 2 months pregnant without a permit from the government family planning authorities. Had they stayed, she could have been forced to undergo an abortion under the regime's one-child policy. After leaving China, Dr. Fu and his wife settled in the United States, where Dr. Fu attended Westminster Theological Seminary and founded China Aid. Today, Dr. Fu is based in Midland, Texas. His organization provides resources and encouragement for Chinese Christians, including those imprisoned by communist authorities for their faith. Dr. Fu has testified repeatedly before Congress and worked with Chinese human rights advocates of all faith backgrounds to shine a light on the abuses committed by the communist regime. And our third witness is Ms. Amanda Tyler, who is the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. She is an attorney and member of the Supreme Court Bar. Her Baptist upbringing in Austin, Texas, inspired her to seek out work protecting religious liberty and informed her principles here. And it's good to have yet another Texan here with us today. Ms. Tyler graduated magna cum laude from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. After working briefly as an assistant to the General Counsel of the Baptist Joint Committee, she went to law school at the University of Texas School of Law, where she earned her JD. She clerked for Judge Barbara Lynn of the Northern District of Texas and worked as an attorney in private practice before joining the staff of Representative Lloyd Doggett, for whom she worked in both Austin and Washington, D.C. from 2008 to 2016. She served first as the district director for the congressman and then as counsel on the House Ways and Means Committee. In January 2017, she rejoined the Baptist Joint Committee as executive director. There she has advocated for issues relating to religious freedom, including filing amicus briefs with the U.S. Supreme Court in free exercise and establishment clause litigation. To all three of you, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Dr. Farr, you may begin your testimony. Thank you, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here and for your testimony today. Dr. Fu, let me start with you. Can you start by telling us a bit of your own story, and in particular why you and your wife were imprisoned in China?
I was a house church pastor back to the 1990s when I was teaching English at the Chinese Communist Party school in Beijing. My kind of use my kind of spare time to share the gospel among the Chinese students in the campuses. And then just in May 1996, after finishing a teaching session, the Chinese state security basically picked me up and threw me into a prison in Beijing. And later on, I found my wife was also thrown into another prison cell that without my knowledge. But she was also staying at the same during the same time. And little did I know, actually, two of the state security agents who were assigned to interrogate me were my students who were sitting in this classroom supposed to be learning English. Obviously, they were spies, or spying on teachers. And then, of course, after we were released and my wife was pregnant, because I was working in the party school at the time, under the one-child policy, even if the first child, you need to get a pregnancy permission card before you can get pregnant, a yellow card, a quota that you can fulfill. So we were searching to find a place or hospital to check on our first, baby health, and even a Christian who worked in the hospital, we went there was so terrified, said she could lose her job if she check on the baby, and without permission. So that prompted us escaped from Beijing first. So I jumped from the second very tall floor of a Soviet Union style of the Communist Party building at the middle of night from the window of the toilet room, and lost consciousness for some moments, and finally, by God's grace, Heidi, my wife, also escaped, and we later on got some barefoot doctor in the countryside, had our baby checked, and then we had been chased by the state security agents all over China and could not find a safe location even to hide. And some real miracle happened. By many people's help, we were able to escape to Hong Kong. That was before Hong Kong was handed over to China. And staying in Hong Kong for over 8 months, and 3 days before Hong Kong was handed over to China, with the help of former President Bill Clinton's direct intervention and Madam Albright, we were accepted as refugees to the United States.
Let me ask you, Dr. Fu, in your judgment, why does the Chinese government demonstrate such active hostility to religious faith? What's behind that?
What's behind that, especially under this current Chinese dictator, President Xi Jinping, there is a very thinking that anything, any force, any organization that is independent of its absolute control is regarded as a threat, political threat to the regime. And I can quote for this specific campaign on, why do they all of a sudden target these thousands of even government-sanctioned churches to remove the cross, to burn these crosses from the rooftop of the church building. And one government document issued internally said the whole campaign is to, I quote, contain the overheated growth of Christianity, end the quote. Of course, we know that when Communist Party took power, there's less than 1 million Christians. And today, even and despite of the persecution, the number of Chinese Christians has already grown to over 100 million. So, of course, they are very afraid. Every Sunday when these tens of millions of Christians went to their private worship, without disturbing anyone. And they are actually the ones, the best citizens, try to help the poor, the needy, and the elderly. Even being accused of illegally doing good, they could be prosecuted. Yet they are still gathering. If they're not allowed to gather big group right now, they're spread it into smaller groups. So what
are the consequences for the Chinese people of being persecuted for exercising and for living according to your faith? What does that do to the people of China?
If a Chinese citizen belongs to a particular group, such as the Falun Gong, or Tibetan Buddhists, or the Uyghur Muslims, or the underground Catholics loyal to the Pope, or independent house churches, if you belong to these groups, that means you will not be allowed to join the civil servants. You are not allowed to manifest your belief at all, and you are not allowed to send, to have your children, as I just mentioned, and you would face the risk of losing the social benefit and certainly no promotion. And if you are leader of this organization, you are facing the minimum, harassment, and it's a state-sanctioned harassment, and to imprisonment. We have seen this year alone in one province like Yunnan, under the name of a so-called anti-evil cult. The only evidence showing this group of Christian ladies, they are being deemed as evil cult, according to the prosecution's paper, it says, oh, they are found in possession of copies of Pilgrim's Progress, copies of John Calvin's Institute of Religion, and copies of the Stream of Desert. And they are deemed as an evil cult. And all of them has received a criminal sentence. And the longest one was sentenced to 13 years. And one Chinese-American pastor, who was my good friend, was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for setting up 16 schools in the Kachin area in Burma, just to help these 2,000 children to have the opportunity to even have a school education. He's now serving in the Chinese prison. His name is Zhang Cao. I hope this committee can also raise his case to the administration and internationally.
Thank you. Senator Hirono. Many Americans are concerned that there is a deep and growing hostility to people of faith and to religious liberty being manifested in Washington, being manifested by congressional Democrats. In this hearing room, we had a judicial nominee, Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who was interrogated and asked from this dais if she considered herself to be a, quote, Orthodox Catholic. Another senator famously decried that, quote, the dogma lived loudly in her. Yet another senator, not on this committee, interrogated nominee Russ Vought for his views on salvation and the path to salvation. Mr. Vought was nominated to be Deputy Director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, and I have to say I doubt that particular tenet of Mr. Vought's faith comes up in the office's ordinary course of business. The Constitution rightly has a prohibition on religious tests to serve in government, but that antipathy to faith and to people of faith is deeply concerning. 25 years ago, RFRA enjoyed bipartisan, near unanimous support, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. One of the saddest days I've seen in the Senate was in the wake of the Hobby Lobby decision, every single Senate Democrat voting to gut the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to take away the protections of religious liberty and people of faith. Often, and that was also in service of things like the Obama administration's litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor. Catholic nuns that the Obama administration was trying to force upon penalty of fines for them to pay for abortion-inducing drugs for others. Force them to knuckle under to the power of the state. Now, the distinction that President Obama and that Senate Democrats have used is often a distinction between what they call freedom of worship and free exercise. The distinction, they argue, is that you're free to worship in your church any way you like, but don't you dare take it outside those church doors. Don't you dare have it impact any aspect of how you live, and the government can force you to violate your faith. If you're a Catholic nun, if you're a priest for life, doesn't matter. The government has the power to force you to violate your faith. I think that view is profoundly ahistorical and deep contradiction to the First Amendment, to the protections of religious liberty. Dr. Fu, in China, in what ways did you see the Communist Party acting to suppress both your ability to worship and also your ability to exercise your faith and live according to your faith?
In China, of course, despite of the Article 36 of the Constitution, they claim citizens have freedom of religious belief, which means they only allow so-called 5 different religions under the so-called patriotic movement to have limited freedom of worship. As long as you worship in the 4 walls of the church building, as long as you're not allowed any Sunday school to be conducted, and now as long as you not allow your children under 18 to even enter into the church building, and you are kind of having that kind of limited freedom. But we all know the definition of religious freedom according to the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So religious freedom is not limited only, or confined in the four walls of the state government institute, of these walls, or administered by so-called designated patriotic clergymen. Religious freedom should also, according to this Universal Declaration, definition, is most importantly is the manifestation of your religious belief. I would actually also borrow what Dr. Ford mentioned in his definition. So not only manifestation in the public square, but also you should be allowed to exercise, or at least to manifest your faith in your own professions, like as attorney. If you should be allowed to make your argument according to your religious conviction. And of course, in China, these are regulated and restricted, and even some of the belief systems are totally forbidden. That's why this 1 million Uyghurs, that's why these hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners, that's why so many other people of faith are not even allowed to exist. If you dare to say you are a Falun Gong practitioner, then you are immediately sent to these so-called mind transformation camps. So this is how the Chinese regime are now managing religion. Yeah.
So Dr. Farr, let me get your views as well on this distinction between so-called freedom to worship and free exercise of religion, which is what's actually protected in the First Amendment. And you described in your testimony growing threats to free exercise of religion in the United States and in Europe. If you could elaborate on that as well.
Sure. If I might, Mr. Chairman, just pick up and answer your question based on what Dr. Fu was saying. You asked him earlier why the communists were doing what they're doing. They're doing what communists and totalitarians have always done, and that is oppressing anybody that opposes them, but there's something special about religion. Religion posits an authority greater than the state. So the Chinese understand this, which is why under Xi Jinping they are doing what they're doing. But the founders of this country understood this. When they were debating what later became the First Amendment, they included a couple of options, and one of them was the rights of conscience. These were, by the way, not Catholics. They were all from some Protestant denomination. The rights of conscience was a natural phrase for them, but they rejected that. They rejected the rights of conscience. It would have said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the rights of conscience. They rejected that and substituted the free exercise of religion. Now, conscience is an internal thing. It was precious, still is. You spoke of it, Mr. Chairman. But the free exercise of religion includes exercising the obligations of conscience. And the founders understood this. They wanted religion in our public life not simply as the rights of American citizens, but to ensure religion was in our public life. Ms. Tyler and I disagree over the meaning and the purpose of the Establishment Clause. I don't believe it was to balance the free exercise of religion. It was to protect the free exercise of religion, to ensure that religious Americans of all stripes, including at the time Jews and Muslims and others in our country, had an equal right in the public square. What this did not only was to give them that right, but accomplish the most important goal they had, and that was to limit the power of government. The First Amendment does that by empowering civil society, faith-based civil society? What would our country be without the Seventh-day Adventist hospitals or the Baylor University, the largest Baptist and oldest in our country, and all the faith-based private enterprises? I think they intended that because all of these groups do things, homes for the aged, the dying, that government otherwise would have to do if they didn't do them. And to return, and I'll stop, to my original point, there's nothing that limits the power of government than having a citizenry who has an authority greater than government and are faithful to that more than government.
Well, Dr. Farr, I think you're right that free exercise has always protected more than just conscience, but actually the right to exercise your religion, to live according to your religion. It focuses on action. And sadly, the view of Senate Democrats today is if they disagree with your religious views, if they disagree with Priests for Life, if they disagree with the Little Sisters of the Poor, if they disagree with Hobby Lobby, if they disagree with a Christian baker, if they disagree, the city of Philadelphia recently suspended its contract with Catholic Social Services because they disagree as a policy matter with the faith views of the Catholic Church. And modern congressional Democrats believe if they disagree with a religious view, that the government has a power to force you to do what they want you to do. And I want to end my question with this, Dr. Fu. I thought it was notable and important that you focused quite a bit on persecuted religions. You didn't just focus on your own faith. You led a home church, but you also focused on the Catholic Church. You focused on Falun Gong. You focused on the Uyghurs, Muslims. You focused on all sorts of people of different faith whose faith traditions are different than your own. And yet you're standing here defending their right to live according to their faith, even if it's not your faith. My question, Dr. Fu, is why should it be important to someone at home to defend religious liberty rights that you or I may disagree with, that are the views of somebody else's, even if, like Democrats today, you don't agree with the Priests for Life, you don't agree with the Little Sisters of the Poor? Why is it important to you, or why should it be important to you, to defend their rights even if you don't share the same faith?
Why I think it is imperative as a Christian, as a religious believer, to defend for religious freedom for all. Because if you only defend for your own religion, or for one group of your religion, or one denomination among your own religion, that is not true freedom. So religious freedom for all, to me, I think, as I read my Bible, as I read all the international covenants on the definition of human rights and religious freedom for all means freedom for communists, freedom for atheists.
Sure.
Because look, these millions of Chinese civil servants, they are ordered not to have any religion attached with them. Right now, there is a purging campaign. Every party member has to fill a form, disclose their religious affiliation. It is in written form. Everybody, and there is a party disciplinary committee even explicitly said, if anybody disclose he or she belong to a certain religious group, then the first step of discipline will come to talk to you, to criticize you. Then if you continue to do that, you will be dismissed. And I can never forget that just in another occasion recently, there was a high school called Pingyang High School in Zhejiang province, which is called the Jerusalem of China because there are so many Christian populations there. This high school happens to have 200 high school students who are Christians. And according to this new policy, every student have to file the form, first disclose whether you belong to Christianity or not. So these 200 revealed them, and then immediately the teachers started talking to them. Then only 80 left and said, I still insist I'm a Christian. But then higher pressure coming in from the government, then the public security, bring their parents there, the teachers there. These are just teenagers, and basically with the threat that if you continue to insist you are a Christian in this school, it's the end of your education. So finally only one student left and still insists he's a Christian to the end, and he called his counselor from the church and says, with tears, and said, how could I deny my belief in Jesus? He has never done anything bad to me. How can I deny my faith in him? So if a state like the communist regime, can impose its own will to those children to regulate their fundamental freedom of their conscience, to exercise their faith, the state will become an uncontrollable monster, and it will harm the freedom of those, even communists themselves. They will not have what they said.
Thank you, Dr. Fu. Senator Hirono. Thank you, Senator Hirono. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here. Thank you for your testimony. Dr. Fu, in particular, I want to thank you for sharing your own personal story of heroism. And I will say a point you made in your last remarks was particularly important about why it matters to protect the rights of religious minorities, even if they're not your own. I think the Constitution draws some bright lines. And so I do not think the federal government should be able to force Catholic nuns or priests for life to pay for abortion-inducing drugs and others. I think that violates their free exercise rights. I do not think the government should be able to force Jehovah's Witnesses to say the Pledge of Allegiance because that's contrary to their faith. I'm quite happy to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but if their faith says otherwise, they have a right to live according to their faith. I'm quite confident that the government doesn't have the power to force Orthodox Jews or to force Seventh-day Adventists to work on the Sabbath. They have a right to exercise their faith. I'm quite confident that the federal government doesn't have the power to force observant Muslims to eat pork. We have a right to exercise our faith, to live according to our faith, and I think what you said very powerfully, Dr. Fu, is a government powerful enough to force somebody else to violate their faith, to violate their conscience, is powerful enough to force you to violate your faith and your conscience, and we should protect the rights of every American. Now, we will keep the hearing record open for 10 days. Senators may ask questions. If you are submitted questions, each of the witnesses are asked to submit an answer as quickly as possible. And with that, thank you for being here. The hearing is adjourned.